All the water that exists on planet Earth is all the water there is. It's mind-boggling to think that through evaporation and rain cycles that we've been recycling the same water since the beginning of time. Everyone who has come before us has shared these waters and will continue to do so. Water is life. It is part of all of us.
I can't overemphasize water, and we're taught is that from that single drop of rain that hits the top of that mountain, and as it comes down the mountain, it feeds everything down that mountain, all the way down, feeding all the animals, the plants, and it comes into the rivers and creeks into the lakes, and the fish, it gives life to all of that, and goes into the ocean, and it does the cycle around, comes back again. And we've been taught that we as human beings were water beings before we became human. We were 9 months in water before we were given freedom to come into the human world. And so we're part of that whole process and understanding that water is so critical to our life.
For the First Nations people, the importance of water, it's basically animals, our ecosystem, everything. We have a saying in our language, which translates to all living things, and which the meaning for is that everything has life, everything has purpose, everything has a spirit. And water is one of the big things that is important to us as First Nations people. The life that it brings, being able to have clean water, that it's important for not only us as humans, but for the ecosystem entirely.
I think whenever we talk about natural systems, we're also talking about ourselves as a natural system. Each of us is a natural system. And I began to realize that the freedom of the water was no longer in many circumstances. And that, of course, reverberated out to the lack of freedom for the fish, the lack of freedom for the ungulates, the lack of freedom for the trees, the sedges, for anything that was living in the ecological culture that had evolved because of the free-running water. And that was why I think I wanted to fully understand why a culture would have taken all of that away.
The Columbia River is one of the largest river basins in North America and was once one of the most productive salmon rivers in the world. The Columbia River rises in the Rocky Mountains in Western Canada and flows over 2,000 kilometers, crossing the U.S. border before discharging into the Pacific Ocean near Portland, Oregon. The province of British Columbia was named after the Columbia River in 1858. The newly arrived settlers farmed the lands and created their own communities, confining Indigenous people to reservations and restricting their rights to lands and waters. The harmonious relationship between humans and nature throughout the basin was irrevocably changed with the construction of numerous dams on the U.S. portion of the Columbia in the 1930s and 40s. Their main purpose was to provide flood control for the rapid industrialization of the U.S. floodplains, hydropower to fuel the economy, irrigation for large-scale agriculture, and navigation locks to provide ocean access for all of these resources. In 1948, the Columbia River flooded in both Canada and the U.S., overpowering the U.S. dams and causing millions of dollars worth of damage to industrial towns adjacent to Portland. This event led to the Columbia River Treaty between Canada and the U.S. and the construction of 4 additional dams. Consequently, the Columbia River is one of the most dammed rivers in North America, resulting in one of the most impacted ecosystems of any river crossing international boundaries. This magnificent salmon-bearing river was blocked by the Grand Coulee Dam, located in Washington State in 1942, cutting off the heart of the indigenous culture throughout the Upper Columbia Basin and their food and trading source for thousands of years. At this time, the Colville Confederated Tribes hosted a ceremony at Tears to mourn the loss of this fishery and continue to pray for the salmon's return.
For Renegotiating people, the water was everything. It was the main highway, it was the hub for spiritual practice, it was the hub for food, it was the hub for travel. It was a way of connecting with the land. And if we look at that, like Kettle Falls alone is known as one of the greatest fisheries in North America. And I cannot imagine what it was like to be in their spot where they had grown up, like my Tupia, my great-grandmother, grew up in a way that every year they would be at Kettle Falls during the fish runs, the salmon runs, and everyone would take home bales of salmon that would sustain them throughout the year. And if you think about just the impact of the food, but the impact of what that was like for these elders who had grown up with this kind of abundance, to hear, okay, the water is going to stop, the salmon is going to stop. Something that I think that we can look at the sky and say, it is blue. And then to suddenly have a time where no longer would you ever be able to see the sky, it would be overcast every day. I think that starts to be the level of impossibility that our people were looking at.
History of the Reconnection is very much connected with Columbia and with all the river systems through our creation story. We know that as human beings, we have a covenant with the Creator to be stewards of this land, of everything on this land and all living things. That means we have this responsibility of protecting all living things, including the waters.
The future of water is increasingly uncertain due to the climate emergency and biodiversity loss. This potential risk to water security is especially critical when rivers cross international borders, such as the mighty Columbia River. Now, an important opportunity exists to rebalance ecosystem function with resource use to improve the overall health of the Columbia Basin. The Grand Coulee Dam did not block all the salmon in the Canadian Columbia Basin. Pacific salmon were able to access the Okanagan River downstream of the dam and thus migrate into Canada through that river system. The salmon in the Okanagan River are the only direct descendants of this magnificent heritage in Canada and are managed by the Silks Okanagan Nation in cooperation with the Colville Confederated Tribes in the U.S.
From about 1840s onwards, best estimates, if you will, 1 to 6 million salmon per year prior to contact. Historically, the stories would explain bundles of fish being wrapped and cached, and within a very limited time, enough fish to sustain, thousands of people at that time. And that's hopefully the goal moving forward.
Columbia River is a very important part of our culture, our being. That big water is so important. That's where the salmon come. Sinclair Coyote, he brought that salmon up the river to us. And when salmon come here, the salmon not only feeds the human beings, but that salmon feeds the land. The eagles, they'll take part of the salmon up on the land, they'll eat parts of it. And even the bears, when they go high up in the mountain, their scat has that fertilizer from the salmon. And so it's fertilizing the land also, giving life to the land. That's how important salmon is. to everything on the land.
Prior to flooding, settlers in the Columbia Valley created vibrant communities based mainly on agriculture and, to a lesser extent, forestry. The Arrow Lakes region was the market garden of the basin, with rich crops of vegetables, fruits, and legumes transported by barge to all parts of the Columbia Basin and south into the United States.
My husband's family would take the barges down the Columbia system full of soft fruits. They grew cherries, apricots, peaches, plums, and they would ship them in huge, huge crates and bushels down to Portail, Washington. And so, of course, the land now has been bought up by people who want to recreate there and have summer homes, and it breaks your heart to see what it was and how it is today.
The Columbia floods of 1948 were a turning point in the resource development history of the basin.
By the time the water receded, damage to human property was estimated at US $100 million in 1948 currency values. 50 people died, 120,000 were evacuated, and 38,000 lost their homes. A report published that October by the Army Corps of Engineers unsurprisingly urged lawmakers to fund flood control projects for the Columbia Basin. The US Senate ratified the treaty immediately within months of its signing. Canada took far longer, in fact, almost 3 years. Some of the local people brought to attention that the flood control provision of the treaty had been given to the United States for in perpetuity, which means it would always be that way, for $64 million US, in today's dollars, about $500 million. There was a great hue and cry. Therefore, the treaty, in its ratified form by Canada, and the US agreed to this, the flood control was for 60 years.
These negotiations resulted in the Columbia River Treaty, which authorized the creation of 3 dams in Canada: a storage dam on the Duncan River, a hydropower and storage dam on the Columbia River at Mica Creek, upstream from Revelstoke, and the High Arrow Dam on the Arrow Lakes west of Castlegar. In addition, the treaty authorized a dam on the Kootenay River, the largest tributary to the Columbia in Canada, at Libyan, Montana, with the reservoir extending back into Canada. All in all, these 4 facilities stored some 15 million acre-feet of water. An acre-foot represents a foot of water over an acre of land. That's a lot of water.
But the economic impact of the Columbia Agreement will not be confined to the project areas. It will, with other exciting developments, bring prosperity to all communities of southern British Columbia.
BC Hydro and the BC government really launched a very optimistic, very positivist perspective on what the new landscape was going to be like. They promised all kinds of recreational opportunities. Oh, rivers aren't good for much, but oh, lakes are wonderful. And they were going to create new communities where the old ones had been flooded, and they had many, many optimistic predictions.
Despite the optimistic predictions that the newly created reservoirs would be a boon for recreation, the reality was totally different.
Almost 300,000 acres of fertile land were flooded in the valley bottoms, along with loss of lands of agriculture and forestry, which was really important to the economy, because not just the agriculture we've spoken of, but the forestry was a great growing and much needed for building and for people's livelihood.
No one had thought about the full long-term effects of a water cycle. The CRT flow requirements caused deep drafting of reservoirs each spring, exposing stumps, forgotten timber, and muddy reminders of farms gone by. Promised boat ramps were slow to materialize. Stumps caught fishing lines and wreaked havoc with boaters. By the mid-1970s, the former Columbia River riparian between Revelstoke and Shelter Bay had become swirling dunes of mud, silt, and sand, and no riparian vegetation could survive under these unnatural conditions. He recalls one speaker in particular at the public meetings, someone who had lived through all the changes brought by the dams. Facing the BC Hydro officials who had flown in from corporate head office to lead the consultation, the speaker made a desperate request. Listen, you've taken away our water and you've taken away our land. Please don't take away the air that we breathe too.
My husband's family lived north on the Arrow Lakes at Deer Park, and many of those homes were destroyed by the rising waters, but the forestry came in and burned the rest of the buildings before the folks had a chance to get all of their belongings out. As well, my husband's family had to remove the graves from the ground of their ancestors who were buried there from the first settlers that settled at Deer Park, and had to ship them one by boat down the river to Robson and find a new graveyard for them to go in, where they do rest today.
The treaty storages caused tremendous losses to the lifestyle, culture, and economies of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. A great many Indigenous graves in the Arrow Lakes area were lost due to flooding. The Arrow Lakes Band, made up of the Sinixt people, were declared extinct in 1956. In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada found that the Lakes Tribe are an Aboriginal peoples of Canada. Despite the enormous disruptions to ecosystem health in communities, the treaty storages on the Columbia River in Canada create numerous economic benefits by generating about half of the total electrical power in British Columbia. On average, about $150 million a year in revenue is returned to the government of British Columbia due to selling additional power created in the U.S. from Canadian water storages.
In our language, there's a word, we call it, it's tulch. It's a transformation of matter into energy. And if you think about that in the concept of water, and what man has done is they've taken that concept and created hydro, taken that matter into energy. And if you think about that, every time a light switch is turned on, it gives life. Whether it's in a city, no matter how far away from the Columbia, the emergency rooms, the hospitals, you just start naming everything that has been given through electricity, what it has done for society. It's given life to the world and to the human world. At some point, that system, by blocking it the way it's been done with the dams, is creating blockage. It's like blocking your arteries in your body system. Eventually something's going to give. And we know that these dams aren't there forever. So we have to utilize what we know about being here for thousands of years, and how do we then bring it back to a state so it gives life again.
The Columbia River Treaty also created an innovative institution called the Columbia Basin Trust. It was established in 1995 as the result of sustained local community pressure from funds generated by the treaty, and has provided millions of dollars to support a wide range of social, economic, and ecosystem benefits across the entire Columbia Basin in Canada. Ongoing funding of around $50 million a year comes from revenues generated by hydroelectric projects on the Columbia, Kootenay, and Pend Oreille River operated by the Columbia Power Corporation. The Trust establishes its priorities based on extensive community consultation. Recent priorities include community well-being, ecosystem enhancement, high-speed internet, housing, local food production, and business renewal. The Ktunaxa Nation, which has communities in the Trust area, is formally represented on the Trust's board, The other Indigenous nations also receive funding support.
So $250 million was endowed to this region, but it was restricted to investing in the development of new hydroelectric projects within the Columbia Basin region, and to do it in partnership with a provincial crown agency, Columbia Power Corporation. And we now have a portfolio of 4 operating power projects in the region that are owned 50% by the residents of the Columbia Basin and 50% by the province of British Columbia.
Changes in the flood control agreement with the U.S. could open up the possibility of altering the reservoir level operations in the treaty storages. A lot of work is being undertaken to determine how such changes can improve the ecological functions of riparian ecosystems around the reservoirs, on fish restoration and community benefits. This work blends traditional Western science with local Indigenous knowledge and involves experts from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities.
10 years ago, I was involved in a study which looked at all the environmental losses from the dams in the basin. I became involved supporting the program to look at improving ecosystem function within the Columbia Basin, decreasing the impacts of the dams. Today, we're here down in the Duncan Reservoir. It's drawn down. It's just beginning to fill up because the snow is just starting to come off the mountains. It's basically been destroyed in terms of a functioning aquatic ecosystem. There's no vegetation along the shorelines. It's a braided channel which has no stability. Habitat value is virtually nil. If we can stabilize vegetation around these channels and keep them exposed for significant portions of the year, we could potentially create spawning habitat in these types of creeks with a change in operating systems. The Duncan just stores water and releases it into Kootenay Lake. If we didn't fill it every year, if we only filled it rarely and only for a short period where the Duncan River flows in, we could get tens, if not hundreds of hectares of improved habitat if we were to change the way we manage the reservoir. However, you end up having to balance these various benefits from the dams, being flood storage to reduce flooding here in Canada to some extent, but mostly downstream in the United States. But also by storing this water, we produce a lot lower electricity here in Canada and in the United States. And what we're looking at is changing the operating regimes in any one or all 3 of the dams and reservoirs to look at ways of maximizing and balancing those different benefits from the dams. There's flooding in Canada. There's also recreational opportunities in the reservoirs, producing fish in the reservoirs. And of course, there's First Nations are very concerned about the potential for returning salmon into the Columbia Basin.
There are different opportunities to change operating regimes in the main reservoirs. The reservoir on the Arrow Lakes south of Revelstoke, BC, may have the best options for restoring more natural water levels to increase areas of ecological function without significantly impacting hydropower production.
We'd like to get back to a regime that's more similar to what the natural seasonal variation was in the elevation. And then when there's extreme flood hazard, when there's really a need to store flood water, is to allow that kind of 1 in 7 year to actually fill the reservoir right up for a very short period of time. And the idea was that if we could actually bring back vegetations and allow it to get established such that it could withstand that 1 in 7 year of flooding.
On the other hand, the Kinbasket Reservoir behind the Mica Dam in the Upper Columbia, north of Revelstoke, would lose large amounts of power production with even modest changes in operating levels. However, the dam was built higher than required by the treaty and stores an additional 5 million acre-feet outside the direct control of the treaty. This storage is managed through a joint agreement between BC Hydro and the US-based Bonneville Power Administration, the 2 major power utilities in the Columbia Basin. The option of reducing the amount of this additional storage to rebalance ecological health on the reservoir shoreline is of great interest to the local Indigenous peoples.
The Kinbasket Reservoir holds a significant amount of water. It fluctuates 50 to 80 feet regularly and leaves vast amounts of land dry. It was built with a larger capacity than was necessary to provide the initial objectives that they had. How can we effect the change in the operations of the Columbia River Treaty System so that there's even a lower level, maximum level in the Kinbasket Reservoir? We believe that if we can do that, we'll protect the wetlands, we can protect the plants that can regenerate along the edges of the reservoir, and we'll provide more growing area for different species, especially in the long mud flats that currently exist.
In the 1990s, the run of Okanagan sockeye was on the brink of collapse, but was saved by the determination of the Silks Okanagan Nation and the Colville Confederated Tribes in the U.S. to restore this critical resource. Working with funds under the U.S. endangered species legislation, the two tribal organizations gradually brought the runs back through transboundary cooperation. In 2013, fish production in the Okanagan River was further enhanced through the creation of a new hatchery, again supported by funding from the U.S. and the involvement of the Colville Confederated Tribes. In addition to the hatchery, there is a research laboratory seeking ways to improve productivity with cutting-edge research. These facilities were in part responsible for a record return of more than 600,000 sockeye salmon spawning in the Canadian section of the Okanagan River system. This return is testimony to the dedication of the Silks Okanagan Nation and the Colville Confederated Tribes to restore the fishery.
We listen to communities saying, we're worried about the health and state of water. We lend ourselves and are very proud of as a nation to share with the Upper Columbia. Columbia proper is our capacity for aquatic health diagnostics. And so that type of story, having the foresight and the vision, it's profound and it's a game changer.
Each year in the fall, the Silks Okanagan Nation gather for a traditional salmon feast to celebrate the return of salmon up the Columbia and into the Okanagan River. This is an empowering event which builds on the vital role the Okanagan Nation played in sustaining the salmon population over the past 30 years. It develops community cohesion and engages the youth in understanding the importance of salmon in their culture. The Sinaiks, Schwepnik, and Tanaha also hold traditional salmon celebrations in the Canadian Columbia Basin to build momentum for renewing salmon introduction in the region.
That's a ceremony of feasting on the salmon every year. This has been going on since before I was born. One salmon, the big salmon that's cooked, everybody takes a little pinch of it. There's so many people. They take a little pinch of it and they have a prayer and they eat that. When that whole salmon is finished, the bones are taken back to the river, put back in honor of what the salmon means to our people. The salmon people that do the prayers and the ceremonies for the salmon every year. That's what this is about. To teach our kids, grandkids, so that they know their connection to the land, to the water. They're being taught that. That's what it is about.
To many of the tribes in the Okanagan Nation people, tribes along the Columbia River that existed on the salmon for centuries, we've always in our what people call legends or stories, in our ceremonies, in our religion, in our spirituality. You know, the salmon are one of our food chiefs. So at our ceremonies, our prayers and our ceremonies, we think help bring the salmon back, have kept the salmon alive, even though the salmon was on the verge of extinction. And even with modern science and our modern fish hatchery, we still need the cultural ways, we still need those songs and those ceremonies, and it's always how the salmon are doing is really how we as a people are going to be doing. When the salmon suffer, we suffer.
We get to pray for the salmon, think about the salmon, teach our children, listen to our elders. So it's really important for knowledge transfer from our elders to our young people, from our knowledge keepers to everybody. And it also takes care of our sacred responsibilities. So we pray for the salmon so that they return. You know, when we come together, even in big gatherings or when families go and fish together, you know, they're out on the land, they're learning, they're growing, they're sharing amongst each other, they're working together, they're building their relationships, not only with themselves, but the land as well. We'd come together and we'd pray and we'd sing, and the babies and the elders would come together with their prayers to release the fish back. And now they're coming back. They're coming back in a huge way. And it's like us coming back to ourselves. It's really a powerful thing because the prayers of our elders and our children are so powerful. And we called our salmon back, and it's like we're calling ourselves back. It's literally healing our people because it's healing our bodies, it's healing our minds, our spirits, and our connection with the land.
Today's youth will play an increasingly important role in shaping future decisions. A number of educators are empowering youth with field experience on how the waters of the Columbia will continue to shape community well-being across the region.
So we wrote a curriculum, and now we're doing mini field schools, just 4 days, maybe up to a week, for educators, giving them an experience of the river like the students get, and workshopping the curriculum with them so that they're empowered to go and bring it to their students. So we want to work with decision makers, and then we want to get decision makers and educators and young people working together to engage segments of the wider public and the communities that they live and work in. I would love to create a transboundary version of the Columbia River Field School. If we could take people from the headwaters to the ocean in Canada and in the US through many Indigenous territories, through many different ecosystem types, to show people the mind-blowing diversity and connectedness of the watershed.
Climate change was not on the minds of the original architects of the Columbia River Treaty, but now the Columbia waters face an uncertain future, which will have an increasingly important influence over the coming decades. For example, increased water temperatures in the summer months will affect the survival of migrating salmon. With such continuous change, it will not be wise to renegotiate the treaty over another 60 years. What is needed is a new form of adaptive management that tracks changes each decade.
What we're trying to do in the Columbia Basin is to collect the data sets to do a water balance approach for subsequent water budgets that will be required by communities in allocating water during the time of the climate crisis era. So the water balance is what the hydrologists tell you is you understand the amount of water coming into a basin or a watershed, the amount of water being used, and then the water leaving. So you have a water balance. So then once you understand what you've got, then you understand what you have available to allocate for subsequent water budgeting for communities, so that communities have more adaptation options, so that we have water, we make decisions around, are we using water for agricultural purposes? Are we using water to water golf courses, to make snow for ski hills? At some point there's going to be limited amounts of water. We're already past peak flow in the Columbia Basin. Our glaciers are meant to be gone in 20 years, so we will have to do water budgeting. And so that's the data we're trying to collect to allow for that to happen.
There's no question that climate change has already begun to impact the Columbia Basin. We're losing glaciers at an alarming rate. We've had a series of flood events. This is only the beginning of the implications of climate change for the basin. Over the coming decades, we're likely to see quite substantial increases in temperature, which is going to be associated with increased wildfire and drought. And at the same time, we're having increases in precipitation, but it's almost all increases in precipitation in the winter and decreases in the summer. So that's going to change the hydrology of the basin, and it will impact the way in which we manage the reservoirs. And it's important to build flexibility with any kind of planning that we move forward, that we can easily and quickly adapt to those kinds of changes that occur, and still try and minimize our impacts on the environmental values in the basin. One of the challenges of renegotiating the treaty at this particular point in time is that the U.S. is probably going to suffer worse implications from climate change, because the southern part of the basin is probably going to be changing from snow-dominated to rain-dominated watersheds, which increases the need for storage. All those things provide challenges in terms of probably the U.S. turning to Canada for more storage and more assistance, but we need to balance that with the fact that Canada also has needs. And we've already suffered tremendous environmental impacts from the dams as they exist today. So what we need to operate under is active adaptive management. In other words, we need to formulate theories of what we think will work, attempt it, try it, and see if it works through monitoring. And if it doesn't work, we need to change that management and try something new.
Some of the original wetlands remain intact in the Upper Columbia. These wetlands are the most important and diverse ecosystems in the basin, extending 200 kilometers north from Columbia Lake. They are all that remain of the original wetlands, which existed through most of the Upper Columbia prior to flooding.
We have 5 different types of wetlands that are driven by the hydrology. Our entire hydrology is quite unusual for most wetlands because it's all driven by the flood pulse that comes and then goes over the natural levees, which are formed by the hydrology as well. So if we don't continue to have that flood pulse, we won't have the Columbia wetlands. The Columbia wetlands are incredibly valuable as a migratory bird route, the most important on the Northern Hemisphere. It's 25,000 hectare wetland, and it's still the only natural 180 kilometers and 2,000 kilometers of the Columbia River that's almost completely natural. So it's really valuable. Another big threat that we have, in addition to the climate, is of course everybody wants more water for agriculture, for people. We're changing almost all of the tributaries that enter. The railroad altered and it has destroyed many of the creeks, especially on the eastern side. This one spot, they took out 400 dump truck loads in just 1 year. So that sediment and that gravel, if it doesn't come down into the wetland, it doesn't keep these levees forming. It doesn't keep the spawning areas.
We must never forget that the Columbia is an international river, and changes in operating regimes in Canada will have impacts on waters in the U.S. This limits the degree of change that can be undertaken in Canada in the long term. Both countries have to think and manage the Columbia River as a single ecosystem.
So I'm talking about us as neighbors with all the people that live within the East and West Kootenay working together under what is called the Columbia Basin Trust, but coming together in that forum, that all recognizing that what impacts one community impacts all the communities. And neighbors also means Canada and the United States. We're neighbors. No getting away from that. And we have to work together in order to protect the environment, to protect our rivers, to protect water, period, just to make sure that we're always going to have clean water for future generations.
The renewal of the Columbia Treaty is for the long haul. It will not be completed in 2 years or 2 decades. It will require sustained oversight by both nations for many, many years to come. Patience, understanding, and empathy will be the hallmarks of its success. The Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Initiative is an example of such international cooperation and long-term planning. Indigenous peoples on both sides of the border are creating long-term plans for bringing the major salmon runs back into the main stem of the Columbia. It will take many decades of research and adapting to a changing climate to be successful.
We have with cursory, and we've included it now into the negotiations on the CRT, saying we need this to be sustainable funding. We need to make sure that we can put as much resources as we can in every year to bring in those salmon back. And I truly believe that with the return of the salmon, we're going to see the health of the river go up tremendously.
The governance of the original treaty was placed in the hands of the major utilities responsible for flood control and power production. These were the main goals of the original treaty, but the renegotiated treaty will have a vital component for restoring some of the water-based ecosystem functions, and this will require the inclusion of a broader range of participants, including Indigenous peoples, in the new decision-making structures. The BC government has endorsed the principles contained in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in law. The government must now seek informed consent from Indigenous nations on various matters as Canada negotiates a modernized Columbia River Treaty with the U.S. The Indigenous nations have observer status at the main treaty negotiating table.
It was only when Canada finally decided to sign on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that that gave us another sort of rung in the ladder to move towards a place where we actually are able to participate in discussions, negotiations, whatever you want to call it, that didn't previously exist. And the fact that we now in British Columbia have legislation, the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples Act, that lays out how it is that we're going to be able to move forward in terms of what our relationship is going to be. But the important fact is, all it does, it sets out the bare minimum standards of how Indigenous people need to be associated with the nation states in this across the world. We need to make sure that they are lived up to.
The issue with the way it's structured in terms of governance is really not so much about the water, it's about what the water produces, which is revenue, money. And if money becomes the issue, then you're not going to do what's right for the water or for the people or for the fish. So we have to be involved in transforming that governance so that it's more balanced in terms of what it provides and provides back to us as a people. In terms of especially the salmon, we need to bring the salmon back. How do we do that? We've got our Indigenous knowledge and Western science, and we can walk hand in hand. And it's not something that's exclusive of each other, but we can work together to actually make this work. And that's got to be combined into the governance. We have to be part of the decision making. We have to be part of setting the next 50 to 100 years as what's going to happen on the Columbia.
Importance of preserving and protecting the natural world is one of the biggest pieces of value that we have. It's not just a value, but it's part of our law, the Indigenous law that would give instructions to us as to how to live as Sahwem, and the relationships that we should have with each other, and the relationship we should have with our natural world.
Members of the Ktunaxa First Nation live on both sides of the border near Grasmere in the East Kootenay region. Each year, they celebrate their Indigenous connection with the waters of the Columbia River by symbolically crossing the border.
It's an opportunity to bring non-Indigenous people out to learn and to be educated as to who we are as an identified Indigenous group of people, but also more so the local people within the area to really have an understanding who the original occupants of this specific land base are. So we started the celebration with the border walk, which is essentially signifying that the border that was put into place by the colonial systems essentially cut our land base in half. It cut our people in half, it cut our families in half. The loss of space and the loss of an ecosystem, which includes, the water, the land, the entire ecosystem, the animals, and that's the significance of the border walk, is that reminder that we were here, we've always been here, and we will continue to be here.
The United States has said that they're interested in ecological issues, and it's been something that's been talked about at the main table, and it's just a matter of how do we balance ecological issues with the continuing seeming need for hydro and flood control measures. And if we're going to look at it in terms of the longer term, which is what we try to do in terms of the popular notion of 7 generations, or what about our children? What are we leaving our children? Can we leave our children and their children a better place to live in that Columbia Basin as a result of our efforts now?
The status quo, based on the current operation of the reservoirs, needs to be adjusted in favor of restoring healthy ecosystems throughout the basin over the coming decades. There is a growing convergence between the Indigenous and settler views to reconnect the waters of the Columbia with improving the health of the river's ecosystems. The powerful force of water in shaping the lives of both communities is a common driving force for operating treaty infrastructure in a way that rebalances ecosystem function with resource use.
It's not just this one river that we're talking about, it's all the waters within our region, because they all flow into the Columbia. And that's what makes me hopeful, is that we are a resilient people, and we take back things that have impacted us and turn those around in order to benefit our people going forward. That's what makes me hopeful, because I see that happening today. I saw it starting to happen as a young leader myself, and it's just gotten stronger and stronger. And I can see that things with the Reconnection, we will always be a major force to be dealt with when anything goes on within our homelands.
I think there's going to be a day when my grandkids are going to see salmon restored to the upper arrow in the Columbia. I've seen in the last 20 years, the pollution rates have already gone down. The rivers are cleaning. It is clearing itself up. It's getting there, but it's going to take a lot more work yet.
The fact is that unless we change our approach of having the human being as the all-powerful, that we're going to continue to get ourselves into trouble. But I'm happy that we've gotten to the place where we're beginning to look at things a little bit differently, and hopefully through education and all of the other tools that we have available to us, that we'll be, that we will be able in a couple of generations to address some of the damage that we've done within the context of the Columbia River, that we know that we've made some progress. But however, I also want to remind people that there's more to it than just the Columbia River Treaty. We know that it's going to be a gradual process, but in terms of us as human beings on this planet, we each and every one of us has a responsibility, and part of that responsibility includes educating ourselves.
What I've learned over the last 3 years in a leadership position is that you're dealing with political entities that don't act on behalf of the things that can't speak for themselves. They're only acting on behalf of humans, and that's been detrimental. But also, I think that if we have strong voices and allies with other groups, organizations, and people that just have the heart and care for all living things in the land and the water, as well as Indigenous views and rights, then I think that there are some opportunities for some brave steps forward, for sure.
So I'm hopeful that here in our local area, as we propose solutions, for example, for wildlife corridors, for maintenance of tributaries, of restoration of creeks, of maintaining water, not just having it all go to agriculture, that they can actually then work with other groups and apply pressure back on the BC government and the federal government to actually make a difference on the lands.
Enough is enough. We've had enough negative, enough impacts to the environment, to the people, to the communities, to livelihood, to the riparian areas, all those living creatures alongside the riverways and the, what once were lakes, now reservoirs, and the people. And it has to be corrected. There cannot be any more negative impacts to this basin area.
I think what gives me hope is the fact that there is a whole range of groups working toward achieving this objective of ecosystem function. We have the First Nations who are working together amiably to try and achieve this goal. We have the local governments committee and the communities throughout the basin, the fact that all these are coming together, and that at this point in time the provincial government is also supporting this, that we may be able to achieve this through the renegotiation.
What Columbia Basin Trust does is inherently good, but it's also inherently challenging. Every single day is an extraordinary challenge, but it's just wonderful to be able to be part of that as a community and have some resources available to take action. I think the story of Columbia Basin Trust is just a wonderful example of what a united region, what people can do if they truly do come together and recognize what they have in common.
If I had a wish for this whole process, it would be that more people understand it as a whole. I don't think enough Canadians understand exactly the critical role that the Pacific Ocean has played in the Upper Columbia's ecosystem. There has been, marine nitrogen found in bear carcasses up in the Big Bend area of the Columbia. And the exchange that we now know about through the health of forests is also something that this region is starving for. The whole watershed that we live in is as a whole, not as two countries.
The powerful role of water is shaping the lives of residents throughout the basin. Water is life. It is part of all of us. We must learn to live in harmony with nature and cease trying to control it. The people of the Columbia Basin have embarked on a journey of reconnection with nature and with themselves. Water is the driving force of this new future. Like flowing water, this shift is unstoppable and powerful. This journey is an inspiration for all major watersheds, especially those that cross international boundaries. To ensure a healthy future for all forms of life, watersheds have to be managed as a single ecosystem.
In our creation stories, Coyote did a lot of work, but Coyote was the person who was, we would call him Wasinchut, which means like overly proud, big ego kind of individual in our creation stories. But in everything that he did, he made mistakes. And he always thought he was above everything else, smarter than everyone, faster than everyone, you know, entitled to more. And it's funny in our religions, you know, in the Christian religion, and I'm not criticizing, but when we talk about we are made in the image of God, you know, I always think we're made in the image of Coyote. We make a lot of mistakes. And we always think, you know, we know the answer, or that we're smarter than the salmon, or we're smarter than the animals, or whatever those pieces are. But the reality is that hopefully Creator, God, has pity on us. And just like Coyote, because that's what Creator did for Coyote. He had pity on Coyote and gave him also the insight and the magic to do good work, which is what Coyote ended up doing and creating many, many beautiful good things in this world. And he is the one that we owe the lack of monsters, you know, the freedom from monsters in our creation stories. And I think that as human beings, I hope that Creator is kind to us and gives us not just the mental capacity, which I think he has done. You know, we're told that we have a long memory but a short instinct, and animals have a long instinct and a short memory. But that we use our memory, our minds, the things, the lessons that we learn to continue to improve, to continue to treat each other and do the right thing. And when I say do the right thing, I'm talking about doing the right thing to each other and the land. But hopefully we can learn.